From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Tonight we're going to take a look and discuss a lot about Tom Judge. As you know, if you've been following the full series, that this is the fourth program on Tom Judge, because Tom was governor for 8 years during this critical period of change that we call the Crucible of Change, from 1973, January 1973, to the end of the decade. He was governor. And many of the changes that we're talking about occurring here in Montana, of making this a people-oriented state, happened under Tom Judge's leadership. So this episode we call Tom Judge Beyond Montana. And really we're going to be talking about international trade, sustainable development, the different things that Tom did to reach beyond the borders. One of the points that was made in one of our earlier shows on Tom was that Forrest Anderson, his first 4 years, and that eventually became his only 4 years, was about looking inward to government, seeing how you could make the government in Helena functional, because it had been unfunctional for so many years under the kind of the copper collar that was being worn by the state. And breaking out of that copper collar was what Forrest's 4 years were about. And it was very pointed inward, in that when Tom Judge became governor, with what had happened with Forrest, Tom Judge was able to take government and reach out, and initially reach out to the borders of Montana, and now in a second term to reach beyond the borders of Montana, to have his vision of Montana and what we have to offer and what the people are about, to go beyond our state's borders. So that's the story we're going to be talking about, and we have three wonderful guests with us who played an important role in that second term of Tom Judge. First is Jim Flynn. Jim was originally from Anaconda. We first got to know each other when he was a legislator from Dillon in the 1973-74 sessions. I was executive director of the party. We got to know each other, and then Jim made a decision to not run again. And Governor Judge, I remember saying, Jim, why don't you come on board and be my legislative liaison? And that started you down the road. You were legislative liaison initially. You stayed through the entire rest of the Judge administration in multiple functions. You were a real utility infielder. You basically, if there was a challenge and a problem, go to Jim, was one of the things people would say. So from 75 to 80 with Governor Judge, and by the way, you stayed on with Governor Schwinden for his full 8 years too, didn't you? Including Fish, Wildlife, and Parks?
I was director of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for 8 years.
Yeah, yeah. So you got to Helena, you stayed for a while, didn't you?
For a while.
Anyway, you made a big impact, and part of that was during this last term of Tom Judge, and we're so happy you're here with us. And Mike Fitzgerald, Mike's been on a previous show we had, and Mike came on board with Forrest Anderson in 1971. You were one of the new kids on the block, we called you, that the baby boomers that were coming into the administration back under Governor Anderson. And when he left after that one term, you stayed on with Governor Judge until 1978. You were on staff doing regular staff work, but you also were working in the economic arena a bit, in the business development arena, and then you boomed out in a thing that Tom was involved with, which is the Montana International Trade Commission, and you became the second director of that?
Second president, yeah. He had created it. Jim Hodge ran it for 4 years. I became president in '78.
And you did that through the rest of his term and then on through 1985, and I would say Mike and I are birds of a feather in a way, because after he left Montana after that, he went to the economic development arena, where I worked for 18 years, and you worked in Washington State, Hawaii, Florida, and are now in Colorado still doing the job.
Same stuff, simply. I mean, it's changing dramatic like life, everything else, but it's fundamentally the same.
Yeah.
How to create good jobs for the majority.
Still making a difference. And Rich Bechtel. Rich was with us before when we talked about the Constitutional Convention. Rich was a staff member for the CONCON, and then went to work for the Legislative Council when that was over. Following that, you went to D.C., and you were a Metcalf intern.
That's right.
And by the way, that is a terrific title, because the number of people that held that are so prominent and so important in what they've done in life, that you're part of a great group. When we say Metcalf intern, man, that's an accolade, really. So
it was a gift of life, I'll tell you.
And then when you were back there, after being an intern there for Metcalf, you went to work in the judge administration under Dean Hart as part of the staff for the Federal State Coordinator's Office for Montana in D.C.
Right.
So you were part of our eyes and ears and our legs and arms in D.C.
Absolutely.
For the rest of the entire judge administration.
That's right, yeah.
So.
And then Mr. Swindon.
And you stayed on there, yeah, for quite a while. Yeah. And you've done an awful lot of things, just like every other Metcalf intern did. So you deserve a program of your own one of these days. Anyway, you guys really contributed a great deal. And as you know, when the second judge administration started, I'd been on staff and then was working on the campaign, and I left at the end of the '76 election. I went out and did consulting and did other things. But I always tried to stay close with what was going on in Helena, and all three of you were playing an important role, which is why I'm so happy to have you here. I wondered if you might just very, very quickly and briefly, starting with you, Jim, just a quick reflection on what it was like working for Tom Judge, the person. What type of person was he, and how was it to work for him at that stage of your life?
Well, I think, reflecting back a lot of years now, Evan, I should have been doing this 20 years ago. But I always felt that Tom was the right person in the right place at the right time. Not necessarily that he was the only one that could do the job, but he was there at a time when the state as a whole, through executive reorganization and the new Constitution, the concern about the environment that was pretty prevalent throughout the state, were all coming to the forefront, and he was the governor during that time who, I think, number one, listened to all of that and understood it, but number two, was willing to do it. He never raised a fuss about, you know, I don't like this part of the new Constitution. The people had spoken, the new Constitution, our responsibility is to implement it. And so I think that things probably progressed in a more orderly manner and quicker than they might have had he been a little different personality that was maybe more resistant to change.
Before we go on, Mike, to talk to Mike, let me ask you a follow-up question, because was your comfort level, because it was very clear that you had a comfort level with Tom and he had a comfort level with you when he said, let's get a hold of Jim and see if he can come to work with us. There was a comfort level there. And that seemed like that might have gone back to the JC days when we were talking about Tom's first election in 1968. The JCs were kind of his field army in that election all over the state of Montana. You played a role in that, all the way back to that, didn't you?
Well, coincidentally, the year he was running for lieutenant governor in
Right.
1968, I was running for president of the state JCs. We did a statewide campaign. And so I'd go to a JC meeting in Glendive and to solicit votes for my candidacy for JC president, and Tom Judge would be there as lieutenant governor candidate soliciting votes from the same people for his campaign. So, and Carol was often with him, and so we interacted in various parts of the state for probably 6 or 7 months. Yeah.
And then lo and behold, in 70 you ran for, 72 you ran for the legislature.
Right, ran for the legislature and was elected and served in the 73 and 74 sessions.
Which you found frustrating.
I often think of the analogy of the legislature and making salami. You don't really want to watch how they make it. The results might be all right, but the process isn't that good.
Well, it was great when you came on board, and you were the liaison always during the legislature in addition to all your other duties.
Well, and that was a necessity that Tom found, is that prior to executive reorganization, the governor was not really in charge of what the executive branch interaction with the legislature was. And so he saw the need to have a staff person to bring that all together so that legislators knew you go talk to this person and that person speaks for the executive branch. Where before they were dealing with 300 boards and they didn't know who was in charge. And as I say, that was his change. And he recognized that it needed to change, and he implemented it.
Yeah. Now, Mike, you were with Forrest.
Yes.
That was your first real serious job.
Yes, only one out of college.
and after having spent those 3 years, or well, really two really good solid years, 2.5 with Forrest, you were there with a new youngest governor in the history of the state of Montana, youngest governor in America at the time, 38 years old. Would you reflect just briefly about the distinction between being a staffer for Forrest and then this new world of Tom Judge before we go forward into the next
Sure,
term?
of course. Working for Forrest was quite aloof, as everybody knows, and you've already heard spoken about on this. We all had access to him, but he didn't want to sit down around a table and brainstorm and collaborate. What should we do next? He knew what he wanted to do and was just kind of orchestrating it and getting the people to go do it. It was terrific to work with him. There was no doubt in any of us that worked with him that we were working with the master of the game there. I mean, it was just so obvious. We've discussed that in other programs. I got to know Tom very well when he was lieutenant governor because, I was around him often. And he was a collaborator, and he wasn't much older than I was, or, at that time. And he was really interested in a lot of different things, but he was particularly interested in what do we do to create more jobs for Montanans. He'd looked at the numbers and saw that our largest single export was young people out of Montana because we didn't have enough living wage jobs. And he was already starting to think about that. He'd had meetings with Maxine Johnson. They'd been over the Bureau of Business Economic Research where they had done a study in 1964 that said basically Montana's a resource colony and it always will be. That's all you can do with it. He thought there was some possibilities of using the resource base that was now backed by a very strong environmental set of regulations and rules and a constitution and control by the governor's office, that we had to be able to use and leverage these resources, which are considerable here, to do other things. And as he became president, he called me and he said, do you want to work on this? And of course I was excited too. He said, so let's start figuring out what we can do here. And that's how I began with him.
So that collaboration and
Totally.
Well, he was a pretty good idea guy, wasn't he?
He was a terrific idea guy, terrific visionary, open-minded, very mentally flexible and adroit. He really was a student of politics, elected politics, and on his way to becoming really a student of government structure and building the foundations of this state that he thought would really be important for its future. Mm-hmm. He was able to articulate that already, not knowing exactly what that was going to be, but He was excited about it. He was totally enthused. I agree with Jim. He was the right guy for the right time in the right place. There were probably others that could, but there's no question that he understood the role, he understood his destiny there, and he was ready to go for it.
Well, this was a big period of change, and as we move into thinking about that second term, which is the real subject here, that's where you got into it.
Right.
Suddenly you woke up and being an intern and you got this call to work for Dean.
Yes.
Tom saw the relationships with DC as being something
very,
that would
very,
be important
very,
for the state.
Very important and new. He didn't have any, he was, in my mind, almost the perfect embodiment of what the Constitutional Convention was about. Working with full breadth of information and knowledge. He was hungry for different points of view. He was a collaborator. People say that there's no such thing as a photographic memory. Well, if that's not the case, he had instant access to briefings that occurred maybe 3 and 4 years ago. So when he would testify before Congress, he was very articulate. He gave beautiful testimony, but he blew their socks off when it came to question and answer. He was fabulous. He could draw on the rich detail of how these programs worked within the state. So he must have acquired that from briefings from his department directors, but also as a legislator, lieutenant governor. He was, and then a whole term as governor. He was fabulous that way. He had no borders, no borders on his thinking, Evan. If there was an issue or problem, it was an opportunity. And that's how Dean Hart was.
He was not an empty suit at all.
Oh, not at all.
No,
he was a
not at
policy
all.
wonk, to be honest.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah.
Well, you know, thanks for those kind of general reflections. Maybe we ought to dive in here a little bit about the situation in terms of DC. Let's just continue on here for a second and talk about, because when we think about beyond Montana, that's one place where his activist governorship made a difference in tandem with who we had in D.C. Tell us a little bit about how that came together.
You bet. I think he was quite an innovator, and it came out of executive reorganization, being able to implement it. But he had a federal state coordinator's office in D.C. He had a strong admiration of Senator Metcalf, and he wanted to govern like Mr. Metcalf was a senator. And so he knew that we had phenomenal information to bring to the federal congressional process as state agencies, because we implement most federal law. So my work there with Dean was we developed with Mr. Metcalf's help an incredible appropriations process, which is the kind of the rudder for the congressional process. They have to pass appropriations every year. And so we learned from each of our departments what were their most important federal priorities.
That was each state department.
Each of our departments, highways, fish and wildlife, all of them. And then the governor would look at those and say, well, these are my top 10 priorities for the delegation. But we put the support on all of those recommendations from each of the agencies. So it was a little book like this, but it tapped the absolute on-the-ground knowledge of how these programs were working and why the funding was important. We got incredible number of appropriations through the history of his
disproportionate.
Disproportionate. Finally,
disproportionate large amount because they had organized. He built a flow.
The chairman of Senate Appropriations asked us to go brief his state on how on earth to bring this, marshal this kind of information for his state. Oregon did the same. But all equally important was Congress wants to keep its hand on every bill there is, every law they pass. They're permanent, but they put a sunset on every funding appropriation. They say you can only spend money on the Clean Air Act on this for 3 years. And it gives them a door to go in and work that legislation, often to undermine it. But anyway, the door's open. Mr. Metcalf put a provision into the law that gave us a spreadsheet of all the sections of law that were going to expire in the next 5 years. So we worked 2 years out, Evan. We would go to our agencies, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and say, what are of these 3 programs that are be reauthorized 2 years from now, which one would bring us could we seek the best improvements? And that's what we would work on. So for 2 years, we would refine legislative amendments. We would take it to our congressional delegation. They looked beautiful within their, and very informed within their committees, because these amendments made sense and they get adopted without even, they'd be a part of the chairman's mark, they called it.
Now,
So-
you were clearly the governor's people. In D.C., when you came back to Helena and sat down or had conversations with the department, it was clear that you were the guys that were doing the governor's work in D.C., is that right?
Yes, and they liked the opportunity because they were able to get input into appropriations and authorizations, and then whenever any problem came. But then the governor, that was the
But you might tell them that no other state was working like that
No.
at that point. The
This
other
was, this was a pretty...
well, there were around 30 state offices in governor's offices in Washington, D.C., but none of them were working at that kind of
they
sophistication.
were monitoring pretty much of
Yeah,
what
they were
Congress
basically
was doing.
reporting what was happening. The other
What Judge did was become very active and started driving an agenda there.
and out of executive out of executive reorganization, he now had all those agencies information that he could flow right into the congressional process to make our federal partners, the senators and representatives, very informed and effective.
So they became significantly more effective in the whole process because he was arming them through Rich and Dean and the whole process and through the department directors with the exact what do we need and how's it performing and the background data to support it, which put us in a whole new league of dealing with Congress in those days.
And then we would give it to their staff members, and it became theirs if they liked it. So it was theirs. It wasn't the governor's. It was theirs. It was true collaboration. The second,
Well, before we get into that, let me just say that I always remember what Lee Metcalf said when a reporter asked him to define the relationship between the Congress of the United States and the state of Montana. And Lee said, back up the money trucks. And in fact, we were one of those states that got a disproportionate return on every tax dollar that went in there. We got maybe 3 or 4 in those days, and now it's maybe 2.
it was almost $10 to 1.
Was it almost 10? Good job.
Well, that was the delegation. But
No, it was collaboration.
Yeah.
The D's and the
Yeah.
R's all joined in that.
See, this kind of interesting how it speaks to the activity level and the commitment of people to work together, which I thought was a hallmark of that time, that there was opportunity here.
Definitely was.
And nobody wasted time on taking advantage of the opportunities that were in front of us. I always thought one of the hallmarks of good leadership is to have good ideas, and then if they don't work, by the way, just walk past them and do the next good idea.
Try the next
And
thing.
and I think Tom did that as well. I mean, he didn't
I
get
think he
stuck.
did that very well. He didn't get hung up on if something didn't work, let's try this. If that didn't work, let's try this. He was very willing to keep trying and experimenting boldly, more so than almost any of the other governors we were dealing with at that time.
Jim, did that kind of approach, how'd that work with the legislature?
Well, it worked well. It was interesting because as staff people, you have interaction with the governor from time to time on issues, but the other thing about Tom Judge, in my estimation, is he was a legislator at heart.
Yeah.
That's where his first love was.
I think you're right.
And during the 90 days of the legislature, I would see more of him during that 90 days than I did the other year and a half when the legislature wasn't in session. Because he wanted to know, what's Matt Himsel think about this? What does Senator Graham think about this? Where's this bill? He was always interested in it. And because of that, he treated the legislative process maybe a little differently than he would have an economic development project, because he understood that it's got its own rhythm and it's got its own ebb and flow, and he was more interested in seeing what that cadence was, what the ebb and flow was, and the gossip than he really was, and we got to get this done. I mean, he had that aspect of it. He had his legislation that he wanted to see
Well,
passed.
if you're a legislator, at the heart of your operation is policy.
Yes.
You're setting policy for the state of Montana or somebody, and he clearly was a policy guy. Did he rely upon you and Keith Coble was executive assistant this second term for a while, and Ray Dorr was executive assistant, and you were in there troubleshooting on everything. Was he relying upon you heavily to make sure the mechanics worked so he could focus on?
Right, and the fundamental part of that process was originally Steve Brown, the staff attorney, and then Bob Lawn, and then Joe Roberts. And there's a structure that has to be followed. But really, Tom, people would ask me, well, what does the governor think about this? You know, what does the governor think about that? And so Tom and I, the governor and I, would, you know, I'd need to know where his head was at on a number of things so that you could answer those questions, not necessarily specifically, but don't give anybody the wrong impression. That's the worst thing you can do. Better to give no impression. But you can't walk around up there giving no impressions all day. You got to have some things to say. But his attitude towards the legislature was one of partnership. It was one of respect. It was one of personal interest, not only in the process, but the individuals, many of whom he'd served with, and an understanding that, you know, if the House does something goofy today, that's not the end of the world. They might correct it tomorrow, or it can get corrected in the Senate. So
There's always that conference committee.
It's a little different than maybe an economic development.
Oh yeah, no, it's a whole different negotiation.
From a policy, since I think we all know how much Tom was creative in policy and open to doing things that were never done before. Let's talk about his policy reach beyond the state of Montana to the west. I think part of the hallmark of this period, and we're talking about it beyond Montana, is how did Tom's vision of things start to have an impact in the entire western United States?
Rich.
Well, there was a Western Governors Conference, but it was kind of more an informal organization. And then there was a very effective group in the West called the Federation of Rocky Mountain States. And the governor was it was made up of private business educators and governors. And the governor had a very respected position there because he was the chief of a state that was operating on all cylinders, and he was so articulate. And in last year that he was the chairman of that group was the time when, earlier, Mr. Nixon and then Mr. Ford did their energy policy. And they came out with a policy of 150 energy plants across the West.
Coal burning and nukes.
Energy plants, 200 nuclear facilities. And so that was a common ground, and they knew that they had to get in front of the energy policy.
That was the period where people used the term that Montana, with all of its resources and open space, would be a sacrifice zone for the energy needs of the United States.
Absolutely, and the other states felt the same way. So 10 of them from the Federation of Rocky Mountain States created WESPO, the Western Governor's Policy Office. And they then led to a group called the Western Energy Board, which was made up of energy experts from every state, and they drove all of our policy. And we brought the water people together, the Western States Water Council, which had always been the water engineers, Jim. They broadened it to include water quality. And the governor was always important that we've now got the best, we exceeded all the federal clean air and water standards. and now we can develop. We had strip mining, reclamation, all those things. So now we can develop it. And the other governors really liked his approach, but they also felt the same threat, and they couldn't act as individual states. So WESPO, this regional group, became a very, very powerful group within Congress and the country, formulating policy, energy policy, where everybody else wanted to come and develop it for us. And then Evan, he did a very interesting thing through Mr. Mansfield and Mr. Metcalf, and that was the federal-state partnership. And almost all these dang programs, federal programs, they'd come in with a 20 to 100-page document that they had to fill out. Our state agencies did, and they basically told you how to spend that money. Well, they developed, based on the Appalachian Regional Commission, these Title V commissions, and that allowed us, as states, governors, the Old West Regional Commission, 5 governors met with the federal executives of that region, our region, and they would look at like economic development, and they would decide how it could be tailored to meet that unique need in each of our states. And so out of that came the Center for Appropriate Technology, MERDI in Butte, all kinds of things like that. So he was also always working with how do you bring states as a better partner within the federal state
The shared
equation.
medical school came out of that.
So that was actually a little ahead.
But the product of this for a period of time was the Old West Regional Commission, which
Yes.
basically was the equivalent of the Appalachian Commission, only
Yes.
it was the interior western Rocky Mountain states, wasn't
Yes.
it? And that was a lot of stuff flowed through that.
Phenomenal experiments, and we've dealt with clean coal technology since the first energy crisis. The Old West Commission went to the Department of Interior, which had passed some legislation, and every state in our region was warring to figure out how they could put a coal lab in their state. There's one per region. The governor brought them together, and we did a regional proposal. And it blew all the socks off of, I've used that term twice now, but it just absolutely astounded the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy that you could have a regional proposal that was so sound. So that they then asked the other regions to mimic Montana and the Old West. So yeah, they did really creative things.
I think it was Justice Brandeis who said that the states were the laboratories of democracy, the
Yeah,
place
perfect.
where you could figure things out, and it wasn't just the states themselves, but you're saying a combination of states on a regional basis was part of the creativity of Tom Judge.
Yep, absolutely.
Interesting. I remember those things happening, and let's take a second and talk about a little regional, how Tom Judge's feel and connection for the other states. Remembering most of these states are agriculturally based, have energy in them and other things, but agriculture was the core bit of the economy in almost every one of those states in the West. And what happened, I think it would have been about 1979 when the price of steak went up to
Oh,
about
geez.
$7 a pound or something. May not sound like much now, but in those dollars in those days, it was a lot. In New York City announced, by God, I think we should stop eating steak. They created a beef boycott. And what did Tom do in your recollection on that? We'll all fill in because I think we all enjoyed this.
Well, the thing I remember about that is I don't remember the reason he was in the Washington, D.C., New York area, but he was.
Once
And-
back there, why not do some
Yeah,
damage?
and I wasn't even aware of his schedule, and I got a phone call one morning from Senator Bill Mathers from Miles City, a Republican whom I think was maybe the
Probably the
President.
top Republican.
president of the Senate at the time. And he told me, he said, I just listened to the governor on the
Today Show,
television
wasn't it? Yeah.
in New York, and he's defending agriculture and the cattle ranchers, and I just want you to be sure and tell him when he gets back home that I'm real proud to have him as our governor. And this was a Republican
And so what did you do after you picked yourself up off the floor?
Republican leader of the Montana Senate. But that's Rich mentioned Tom's memory, and I never did hear what he said on TV, but evidently he was expounding facts and figures that Montana ranchers understood. And he just had that ability to do that sort of thing and do it at the right time.
Now, his relationship with the other states empowered him to make this a bit of a public negotiation of some sort, was it?
Yeah, he brought the whole region together. Tell
Yeah.
him that story, Rich. And that.
Well,
Well, he got all the other governors.
yeah.
He said, "Well, you."
He basically said, "Hey, if you're going to boycott beef, all of our western states, our citizens are going to quit visiting New York City as tourists.
No tourism from the
No
West.
tourism from the West." Oh my, that woke him up pretty fast. Oh, gee, maybe we better talk about this.
It was the
And they
end of the
did.
beef boycott.
Oh, it
for
certainly
him.
was.
It was how about everybody that grows beef, including Texas,
Yes.
stops visiting New York and watching Broadway plays?
Yeah.
How about that? And so that was it was a very interesting event, but it spoke to the unity of the governors out here.
Absolutely.
That they kind of knew each other, and Tom had relationships with that were so good with. Well, I'm trying to remember Art Link and Dick Knipe, Art Link in North Dakota, and Dick Knipe in South Dakota, and
Lamb.
in Colorado,
Mr.
and-
Matheson, Utah.
and Matheson in Utah, and Dick Bruce King in New
Yes.
Mexico, Jerry Apodaca down in
Yes.
in Arizona. Of course, California governors never talk to anybody in the West.
No.
There's something different.
Mr. Dumajan, yeah.
But those relationships were very interesting. And by the way, a reflection on that time was the bulk of the governorships in the West were Democratic.
They were at that point.
Not totally, but
Yeah.
but there was no
By and large.
partisanship in when they worked on policy.
No,
Did they
not at
ever
all.
have any?
Not on those issues. They saw a common need, and they really worked together. That's why I say it was almost like their perfect reflection of the Constitutional Convention.
So we've this regional stuff, reaching out there. Tell me was important in terms of all this policy stuff. Mike, speak a little bit to the economic reach, the trying to use the International Trade Commission as a vehicle for getting stuff done in Montana. I think it started first briefly under. Did it start under Tom or did it start
No,
under
yeah, it
Forrest?
started
yeah.
with Tom.
Tom.
And really, what I think the impetus was you remember that OPEC cartelized oil in 1973, pretty much right after he came into position, taking oil worldwide from $0.25 a barrel till $3 a barrel, which put enormous pressure on Montana and Wyoming coal particularly. Companies were lining up there from all over the world to exploit this coal. And then that, of course, caused the environmentalists to line up nationally. So the war zone for the coal wars started right there, and the OPEC cartelization of oil was the reason for that. That's one thing that was underway already. He'd already determined that he wanted to see what could be possible to use Montana resources to hopefully vertically integrate them, be sending lumber rather than just logs out, processing grain rather than just sending it whole, right down the line.
We
Wood products.
later had a term for it called value adding.
Value added, right.
But that's what it was.
That's
right?
what it was, value added, and with the idea of job creation, that we're not going to be able to create good paying jobs here unless we can use these resources in a higher way. Because right now, people are just working for the railroad, and the railroad's just hauling it away. The miners are just sending, the executives of the miners were just sending everything away. The wood products companies were just sending logs away. We were making no furniture, no vertical integration
We were
at all.
kind of a third world country economically in that we had commodities,
Totally.
and commodities were the product.
Right, resource.
And they
we
went
were
out.
like Ecuador.
and
We were
all-
a resource
yeah,
supplier.
Yeah.
So, and we'd already looked at this information from the Bureau of Business Economic Research that said it was our fate to always be like that. But He didn't buy that. So we started brainstorming of what can we do, and what really gave us the link is Senator Mansfield sent a person to visit with us by the name of Bob Panero, who was an international consultant, whose one of his clients was OPEC, the oil exporting companies. And Saudi Arabia had done a study where they wanted to create more agricultural protein for their people there, and their own analysis said Wyoming and Montana, that chunk of area, has the same kind of conditions that we do, ironically. You wouldn't think about that now, but they have severe heat in the summer, cold in the winter. We need to do the research based on a place that has those kinds of ranges of what kind of, can we grow sheep or can we grow cattle? What does that the beard be? What kind of crops can we grow? So Panero came to Mansfield, Mansfield sent Panero to us, and that's where our work on international began. It wasn't too out there, because the governor had already called together all the business leaders right after he got elected and said, I want to work on this vertical integration of the economy here. They all said, and this, he had the chairman of Burlington Northern, he had a chairman of Milwaukee, of the timber companies, the mining company, the chairman of Anaconda, got them all in his office there and said, I want your help to do this. And of course, they needed him now because we had the machinery to either let them develop or not develop. So they would have never had to come in any other year or any other decade. But they all told him to the person, Dean Hart and I, and I'm not sure who else was all in that meeting. They said, Governor, look, Montana's 500 miles farther away from any other metropolitan area in the United States. This is the most remote state in the United States other than Alaska. There's no local market. He said, we can't do that. We don't know how to do that as we sit here before you today, but we will co-found or found an organization to work with you to see what can be done. And they pledged each $100,000 over 3 years, and there were 20 of them there. So that gave us that kind of a budget.
$2 million a year, essentially.
Yeah, $2 million a year for 3 years. And you figure out how you want this to work, and then let us know. We're in, but we cannot today start promising you we're going to start hauling lumber instead of logs. So that's what was the impetus to create the Montana International Trade Commission. And that was simultaneous with Panero coming to us. And it was simultaneous with Roland Rennie coming back to MSU, who had been away, for a phenomenal, he'd been president of the SU, but he was a world-recognized agricultural theory and economist. So all of these things kind of came together, and we sat down. He said that he thought we could probably get a consultant team from MSU to go start working with the Arabians to start figuring this out, and that was the first step. And this is a multi-million-dollar contract. We ran it all through the Trade Commission because it was the only way we could do it at the time. That was the first project, and they did a lot of initial research, of which MSU got paid. So that was starting to leverage Montana assets, the university system, to do international things that would benefit others, so we could start bringing some things back to us. And out of that went some cattle on the hoof, and we made some sales from that, but mostly was doing the research. That was the value, so we were selling intelligence there. Panero came back about maybe just a month later and said, Sonatrach, the National Energy Company of Algeria, wants to do something similar. They have 100,000 employees, they want to look. So that got us involved in another project there. And while we were doing that, OPEC had put a lid on that nobody else could sell oil for less than $3 a barrel. So what Algeria wanted to do with us is, how about a swap of Montana grain or grain that you would put together in the West for oil? We can still do barter trade. That got us working on what would have been probably the biggest barter trade ever in history had we been finalizing it. And we got down to arguing about a nickel a barrel at the table in Paris, and the guy that represented Western Wheat Associates wouldn't do the deal for a nickel. He would have been on the front page of Business Week magazine. But anyway, that one didn't work, but we did a lot of smaller deals. The next one was a gold mine in Brazil. And then we started figuring out, because the Japanese came to us and said, can we buy some of your coal? And we thought, oh God, what a political brawl that's going to be. So we sat down with them, and we were dealing now with
prescient could you be?
With Mitsui Trading Company, which at the time was the largest company on the planet.
Yeah.
We explained to them that this is going to be, we can't just sell you coal, this is going to be challenging. we have to get some reciprocity to make this valuable for Montana. And they said, so what do you want us to do? So we drew up a contract, I still have a copy of this, of all of the studies and analysis we wanted them to do about creating slaughterhouses, doing grain processing, building forest products industry in here that would build furniture and whatever. And we'd already done a study of why was Scandinavia the most prominent country in the world, those countries are, in wood products. And it was because 100 years ago they'd cut their last long-term growth, old growth timber. To stay in the timber industry, they had to constantly refine it using every part. So by then they were already, it's IKEA, they had 100,000 manufacturing companies of wood products in Scandinavia with 1/10 the wood supply. Why couldn't we do that? So that was another project we started on.
A lot of interesting creative stuff that went on with that thing.
All of it. We were all over the place.
I want to see if we can turn that same focus, which was for outward development, into how, because remember, we were challenged also about this energy thing that was scary.
Yeah.
So we wanted growth on our terms,
Of course.
value adding, and still didn't want to become the sacrifice zone. And out of that kind of sensitivity, I think, came the Governor's Economic Development Forums, the Malcolm Forbes, Fritz Schumacher
Forums, yep.
Big meeting,
Yep.
and then they merged out of the small town renaissance stuff from the 1940s, which was Montana based.
That's right.
Which
That was.
and evolved into almost Small is Beautiful, and yet.
Exactly.
How did that all come together? Because it looks to me like there was an awful lot that suddenly was happening inside Montana
Oh, it was.
to
It was.
tap our
Dorothy
intellectual
Eck-
energy. And
Dorothy Eck
Dorothy
helped
Eck.
us remember that small town renaissance had happened, and that was when Ed Melby in the 40s had become president of the University of Montana. I don't know where he came from.
Chicago.
He got a grant from the Ford Foundation to take a look at what can we do to make sure small towns in Montana are self-reliant and survive. And it was basically public forums that were organized then. And all of the old timers then that we started rounding up, Harold Stearns, and I mean all that whole generation had participated in this and knew about it. And basically what it was is what we would now call sustainable development or self-reliance. It's bringing the community together to really define for themselves, what do we like about this place? What do we want to change? What are our opportunities? What are our assets? What do we want this place to be 5 or 10 years from now?
in the 40s, that had to die because it was totally contrary to the copper collar.
Absolutely, and that's
The,
exactly why it died.
the
They
decisions
crushed
were
it.
being made on the 6th floor of the Hennessy building
They
or
crushed
a
it.
boardroom in New York City.
As soon as
about-
Melby was gone, they crushed the deal.
Yeah.
And-
And he probably
but-
left because they killed all of the initiatives
They went to the
forwarded.
Ford Foundation, got the funding stopped. I mean,
But this came back to life.
But what that talked about, it was really inspiring for us that learned it at that time that it even happened, because there was a cultural phenomenon there that had a genesis of what we were now trying to manifest here. And it fit exactly with self-sustainability or sustainable development as it was small town, or Small is Beautiful, Schumacher's book.
And the basic theme of this entire series, which is how we moved from being a corporate
Exactly.
colony to a people-oriented state where the people were empowered.
That's the
So
whole
moving
thing.
to Small is Beautiful and economic development forums.
It was the
How many economic development forums did we? I
Oh,
remember.
God, I don't
I
know.
think I had a contract
Sydney
to
would
work on
know.
those.
A dozen, I'm sure.
You know,
A lot of all over. But that was the genesis of those forums, is to go ask people, here's what the demographics say and the economics say is our state. We had to be able to be doing better than this. We need to do better than this if we're going to keep our youth here, be able to bring them back and have
Yes.
living wage jobs. We have all these assets, which were considerable then: food, water, minerals, timber. I mean, we were a resource colony. How do we start using that? That was the theme. And then from there, that's when he got Malcolm Forbes and Schumacher to come to Montana to have a
Now
forum
there's an
on the future
interesting
of Montana.
combination.
But on the opposite sides of the spectrum. I mean, you couldn't get farther apart.
The ultimate capitalist.
But
with,
Tom was really smart enough and intelligent enough and thoughtful enough to know that if we're going to do this, it's going to have to be done from a majority in the middle that supports it from all of these factions. This is not going to be able to get done in the fringe. It's too complex, this kind of development that we were looking at. So he called up Lou Mink and said, Lou, I need you to help me get Forbes here. Will you do it? And Lou said, hell yeah, I'll put on a train and I'll bring him out there. So we got him.
He didn't take a balloon. He came on a train.
In the meantime, Sidney Armstrong, Dean Hart, I and my wife were in Britain, and we stopped by at the Schumacher Institute in London and said, can we get Mr. Schumacher to come to Montana? And they said, yeah, he's going to be there in like 6 months or so. So we said, can we get him to come into the U.S.? And they said, yeah, we'll start working with you right now. So then we got them both. Then we came back and got the, Margaret Kingsland was running the humanities. So she agreed to give us a grant to do this, but she said, you got to have a lot of humanists involved in that. I wasn't sure I knew what a humanist was at that juncture, but we went out and run. I mean, there were a lot of them because, I mean, basically they were, so we had Tom Powers, we had Bill, I'll have to think, Northern Plains Resource Council. We had Phil Tawney, we had all of these people.
Rick Applegate.
Rick Applegate, all of these people on the environmental side, got them to write, and we're on the co-sponsorship of this whole thing, to write essays, and then we got George O'Connor, many others, ranchers, other industrialists to write pro-development ones, and then because this was going to be such a big deal, we got the newspapers in the state to all publish all of these essays, starting out 2 or 3 months before the event. So at the event, we had 1,000 people there.
So what we had was we were trying to say to Montanans, think your way through this.
Exactly. There was no blueprint, by the way. There was no other state we could point to or no other even country say we had to do it like X, Y, or Z. We were inventing this thing. It was creating a blueprint, creating a vision for which there was no blueprint at that time other than what we were bringing to it, what Montanans were bringing to it.
Pretty dynamic. I want to ask one other thing on the international front, then we'll pull back in here, because it seemed like Tom himself in the second term became an ambassador of sorts for Montana overseas.
Very much so.
That was happening an awful lot, wasn't it? You had to keep the train running, some of you guys, while he was over in China or in Europe. And
well, yes, Tom had, in addition to other attributes we've mentioned, he was a high energy guy. I mean, he would much prefer to be in a car going somewhere or on a plane going somewhere than sitting at the office signing papers or answering the telephone. So yeah, that was a role that, because of these things that Mike and Rich are talking about, required that kind of activity from the chief executive to keep it all going. So yeah, he was gone quite a bit, but had a staff, and communications aren't what they are today, but it worked all right.
You know, if you look at it, him being overseas, in between the legislatures, essentially, I think it's fair to say that he was doing good things for Montana, but we do live in a political world, and some of that engendered opposition and criticism.
Yes, of course. Yeah, of course.
That certainly didn't help him in terms of his identity, because it's pretty easy to pick on someone who's off on what someone thinks is a junket when in fact they're doing marketing for Montana.
Right.
How did that?
Well, let me say, Evan, when I meant his traveling, was that the exception was the legislative session.
Right.
Legislature was in session for 90 days. He was there. Yeah, because you never knew what was going to come up.
Yeah.
And things, there's an ebb and flow, but sometimes it can be pretty speedy, so you got to be there. But, Tom was groundbreaking implementing the Constitution, groundbreaking ironing out any wrinkles that were in executive reorganization, and groundbreaking with his traveling for economic development. I mean, nobody had ever done that before. But as Mike and Rich it was necessary. And he realized that and did it. But yeah, there was some political consequences from that. Those first few trips to Japan, headline news, editorials, the whole 9 yards. Governor goes to Japan today, and it might be a little blurb on page 12 of the newspaper.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably
Yeah.
true. And the Far East was opening up to us, at least partially, because Mike Mansfield was suddenly ambassador in Tokyo.
See, that was to take advantage of that. To not take advantage of that would have been a missed opportunity, because the doors swung open from any Montanan, not just in Japan, but in all of Asia, because he was so respected.
There were, I guess I would comment about one thing that is that when our dear Lee Metcalf passed away unexpectedly, I think Tom, being a legislator at heart, he really would like to have been a senator, and
Yes,
it just
yes.
wasn't in the cards. In Montana history, that just wasn't going to work. So he spent his last 2 years just more aggressively pursuing the international opportunities, the regional opportunities, more than ever before. Well, I told you guys that an hour goes by pretty fast, and we're almost there. I kind of go around one after another and ask you your reflections on what did your service mean to you this time you served with Tom Judge? What did it mean to you personally and professionally?
It allowed me to use all the skills that I had acquired before and more, but it was basically, to me, the fruition of the Constitutional Convention. It was collaboration, it was working across party lines, it was being well prepared on anything, and that whole spirit of reaching out to low-income people, building the environment, best protections possible, and also working on jobs. And it was that kind of wholeness of working for the common good, the whole, that really motivated the CONCON. Those folks did that. Well, in his practices, he really tried to manifest that.
So it came full circle for you.
Oh, yeah.
Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I lugged a lot of miles with him. Dean Hart and Jim Hodge and others trying to put these projects together. Some were successful, some weren't. But he was a terrific collaborator, and he was so superior dealing with the people that we were trying to deal with. I mean, no other governors were out there. There were very few U.S. companies even abroad at that time, because the U.S. economy was so big. Most of them were coming here. He was just superb, representing Montana in these international public forums.
Roll into any boardroom and
anywhere and everywhere.
yeah.
And the next day go visit with some ranchers and
Right.
talk
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
Yeah.
prices of wheat
Yeah.
and that, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, it was a terrific education
Well,
for
he
me.
helped get you
because-
started on a long track,
Oh yeah,
I'll
yeah,
tell you.
absolutely it did, because
Well, Jim,
Well-
in your case,
Well, as you recall, Evan, I came to work a legislative session.
yeah, you were going to just be there for
90 days, and 6 years later. But it was, I mean, I've always felt that, we're of the JFK era, that
Absolutely.
you got to do your part. And when the governor asks you to do something and you're in a position to do it, even if it hurts a little, I think you have a responsibility to do that. And working with Tom and the package. I mean, you worked with Tom, but you also worked with Ted Schwinden
Absolutely.
and everybody else, and so it's a life experience.
well, thank you, all three of you, for the part you played in that administration, which made a big difference for Montana, and for telling that story here today about the governor who made the biggest difference for this state in his 8 years in office. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.